Hey guys, in this video, I'm going to be going over my final 2020 Electoral College map projection on what I think is going to be happening in this upcoming election here between the Democratic challenger Joe Biden and the current incumbent Republican president Donald Trump. And my map is just slightly different than the one that I made a few weeks back. And also this version, I'm going to be putting in the safe, likely leans and tilt option instead of just filling them in one way or the other for the Democrats and Republicans. So I'm going to go through every single state, all 50 states plus the District of Columbia. I'll start west, work my way back east, and the states that have a little bit more in the way of being competitive or a bit more of a discussion, I'll spend a little bit more time on those areas. So starting way out west, Hawaii, extremely consistently strong for the Democratic Party. That is going to be a safe blue one. Alaska, we actually have seen some pretty close and competitive polling results. In general, this tends to go over to the Republicans, but it actually is looking like it could shape up to be a pretty close competitive race. You might even put it in the tilt range for the Republicans. I'm going to be setting it as a lean over to Trump and the Republican Party. Now moving down to the West Coast, California, very safe for the Democrats, as well as Oregon and Washington. Now we're going to start to move in some more competitive states, starting with Nevada, but this one has been a state that has been trending towards the Democrats. It was a pretty solid result from them back in the 2018 midterms. It could still be relatively close, but you would certainly give the lean over to Biden and the Democrats to continue to retain that one, especially after Hillary Clinton was able to defeat Trump in the state 4 years ago. But the flip that I have here, the first flip result from 2016 compared to now 2020, is the state of Arizona. Biden, I think he can close the gap enough with the older voters, do much better than Clinton did with that demographic, as well as do a little bit better with white voters, and that should be enough to potentially get Biden and the Democrats over the line. And not just on the presidential result, but also there's a Senate race that's looking very favorable for the Democrats to pick up in the state of Arizona. Going to be giving this one as a lean over to Biden. Moving up to Utah, very conservative state, consistently strong for the Republicans, even if Trump isn't necessarily the kind of Republicans that people in Utah are as thrilled about as other types of Republicans. It's still one that's likely to be very safe for Trump to continue to win that one. And then also Idaho, one of the more conservative states, along with Wyoming. And then moving in to the upper plain states, North Dakota, very strong, consistent for the Republicans, as well as South Dakota, as well as Oklahoma. I think Kansas is one step below being safe. The polling has been slightly more competitive in Kansas than some of these other more deeply red states. And then Nebraska, they're kind of interesting because they split things up, not just with a statewide vote, but also by their congressional districts. And I actually think that the second congressional district is looking pretty good for Biden to pick that one up. Also could be a pickup in the Congress for 2020 in that second congressional district. But then the rest of the state is looking safer for Trump to go on and grab that. And then moving over and up to the state of Montana, where we're likely to see a very close and competitive Senate race, kind of like what we saw back in 2018, but it's the Republican who's an incumbent this time around on the Senate side, where the Democrats had the incumbency advantage last time around, but the Democrats are also throwing in what would be their strongest candidate with the Democratic governor of the state. So that one's worth keeping an eye on and could go right down to the wire. But on the presidential side, I expect Trump to do a bit better against Biden than what we're going to be seeing between the Republican going and fending off the Democratic governor there in Montana. Going to be giving this one as a step below being safe. And maybe Montana surprises and it's a bit more competitive than what I'm expecting, but I'm going to be keeping it right in that slot. Now, Colorado, this one has been a state that's been trending consistently for the Democrats in recent election cycles. Just going to be giving it one step below as safe. It's not quite as safe of a result as something like a California or Hawaii, for instance, but one that you would certainly expect Biden to pick up, especially after Clinton won the state back in 2016. And then New Mexico, also been a state that's been trending towards the Democrats. It would be a surprise to see Trump have success and be able to get over the line and really make things competitive in New Mexico. And this is the case throughout the Southwest, where the Democrats have been gaining quite a bit in recent election cycles. That's also making a state like Texas be a bit more in the way and competitive. I think this one's going to go right down to the wire. We've been seeing extremely high turnout. We'll see how that affects how things happen on election day, now that we're going to have a lot more vote in Texas this time around than what we had back in 2016. If we just take a look back at 2018, the midterms, a statewide election for the Senate was actually relatively close between Beto O'Rourke and Ted Cruz within a couple of points. The demographics have shifted a couple years since then. We'll see how that plays a role. I actually think Biden has a decent shot at picking up Texas, and if that's the case, this election is over. But still, for the time being, going to be giving it as a tilt over to Trump to retain this one for the Republicans. Now we're moving into an area where Trump is going to have a lot of safe states, starting with Missouri. Maybe you could put Missouri one step below being entirely safe, kind of also like one of these Midwestern states like Indiana and Kansas. But still, nonetheless, I do see this one as being a bit more safely red than even Kansas. And then also Arkansas, that one's going to be safe, as well as Louisiana, Mississippi, and then also Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia. And these states not really needing all that much in the way of a discussion about them. Trump still significantly above water with his approval in these areas, states that he won by very significant margins back in 2016. Even though Biden probably closes that gap a bit here in 2020, you'd still expect Trump to grab those. And then the most blue of the Midwestern states, very consistent statewide for the Democrats, is going to be the state of Illinois. And moving down to a couple of very close competitive battleground states, that's going to be Georgia as well as Florida. So we'll start with Florida. Back in 2016, Clinton close with Trump, but lost by about a point or so, a little bit more than that. If you go to the two prior cycles before that, Obama was able to carry the state with Biden as his VP in 2008 as well as 2012. Statewide, it is always consistently close in these presidential results. Where I think Biden makes a difference in contrast to Hillary Clinton is he's likely to do better among the older voters, and I think he closes the gap among the white voters enough to get him over the line. And again, what should be a very close result there in Florida. Just going to be giving it as a slight tilt over to the Democrats. And the same thing with Georgia. Georgia is a state that's been trending a bit more competitive. We saw an extremely close statewide race in 2018 for their governorship. The Democrats have put a ton of work into this state to increase voter turnout, but also what's been favoring the Democrats in this state particular is the fact that the Atlanta suburbs have been trending towards the Democratic Party, the population center of this state. That's making things very close. It's also one of the more diverse states, which helps the Democratic Party, and I'm giving this one as a slight tilt over to Biden. I also think the Democrats have a decent shot at maybe even picking up a couple of Senate seats, but there's been some pretty good polling for the Democratic Party out of the state of Georgia this past week, and I think it just slightly favors them at this point in time. Now, South Carolina actually has a Senate race that is going to be relatively competitive, and maybe even the Democrats surprise and are able to take down Lindsey Graham. I think that Biden's going to have a tougher time against Trump than what Harrison has against Graham, but going to be giving this one as just a step below being safe for the Republicans. And then we move up to North Carolina, and this one is one that you'd probably give as a little bit more of a lean over to the Democrats than even what you would give them in Georgia and Florida, not just on the presidential side, but it's also looking like they have a decent shot at grabbing that Senate seat, and also the governor's race is looking pretty favorable for the Democrats to continue to retain that one in the state of North Carolina. This one's probably somewhere between a tilt and a lean for the Democrats at this point in time. I'm going to be just giving it as a slight lean for the Democrats. Virginia, this is a state that's been trending towards the Democratic Party over the past decade plus. And Joe Biden is definitely the kind of Democrat that Virginians can get behind. We saw this with Biden's landslide victory over Sanders in the 2020 Democratic primary, and this one is feeling like it's going to be a relatively safe result for the Democrats to continue to pick that one up. And now we're going to move our way into Democratic territory in the East into the Northeast. So the District of Columbia, the most blue area in all of the United States, and then Maryland, Delaware, very safe, New Jersey, very safe, as well as Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Vermont, where as we get here into the upper Northeast, New Hampshire and Maine can be a little bit more competitive than the rest of these northeastern states. Also going to be filling in New York. And actually, at that point in time, it gets you to 287 based on how I have things filled out up to this point in time. But getting up to New Hampshire, not quite all the way being safe, but actually Clinton was even able to carry this state back in 2016. Trump does not have great approval numbers in New Hampshire, which is likely to make things tricky for him. Going to be putting it as one step below being safe there statewide for the Democrats. And then Maine statewide, I expect it to be a relatively safe result where the 2nd Congressional District is the one that is in a bit more of a toss-up range, and Maine does things similarly to Nebraska where they divvy things up statewide and then also by congressional district. And taking a look at the 2nd Congressional District, this was an area that the Democrats were able to pick up a congressional seat in the 2018 midterms, and also they have ranked choice voting this time around for the presidency, which could potentially be a boost to the Democrats, just like it was back in that 2018 midterm congressional race. And I'm going to be giving this one as just a slight tilt over to the Democrats and what's going to be a pretty close result there in that 2nd Congressional District. And now moving into the Midwest plus Pennsylvania, but I'll start with Indiana. This is still likely to be a pretty safe result as Mike Pence, the VP, the former governor of the state, and Trump did well in this state back in 2016. The key to this election could very well come down to Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania like it did back in 2016, but the Democrats are looking better this time around, not only based on the current numbers, but also if we look back at the 2018 midterms, the Democrats did very well, winning statewide Senate races and governorships across Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, as well as Pennsylvania. I'm going to be giving Pennsylvania as a lean, as well as Michigan and Wisconsin in that lean range. I think you can make the argument that Michigan could even be a step over from a lean, but we're going to be giving it in that area. Minnesota is a little bit more to the left in general than Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and we saw this where Clinton was able to grab that state back in 2016, although it was one of the more close and competitive results, but going to be putting this one as a step below safe there in that Midwestern state. And then we get down to a couple of states that I had a really hard time putting a final prediction on, and this is one of the changes here. I'm going to be flipping Ohio back to the Republicans with a slight tilt. Now, we actually did see a poll come out the other day where Biden was up on Trump by 5 points in Ohio, but we've also seen other polls where Trump's been ahead. Expected to be very close, especially in contrast to what we saw in the state back in 2016, for instance. But I think Trump is able to do just enough to get over the line in Ohio, where I don't think that's going to be the case in Iowa. There's a bit more variance in this state, also smaller population. But we've seen bigger swings in Iowa than what we have seen in Ohio. We just go back to Obama in 2008, where he won by around 10 points, but then 8 years later, Trump winning the state by about 10 points. So quite a big swing between those two results, for instance. Biden's favorables are quite a bit better in a state like Iowa than Hillary Clinton's were back in 2016, a bit more palatable of a Democratic option for the voters in this state as opposed to the choice that they had 4 years ago. I think the Democrats have a pretty decent shot at possibly picking up this Senate seat as well in Iowa, and Biden doing well in the state would be important for possibly bringing that Senate race along. On top of it, it's going to be really close, but I'm just going to be giving this one as a slight tilt over to the Democrats. And that is my final map projection here, where I have Joe Biden at 357. I have Donald Trump at 181. And there's enough of these states that are in that tilt to lean range where it's still possible that Trump could surprise and get just enough to get over the line. But there's also the possibility where Biden could really put things away if he's not only grabbing the states that I filled out for him, but also surprising and grabbing something like a Texas and an Ohio on top of that, two states that have a lot of electoral votes, 18 and 38 for those two areas. So we'll see how all this shakes out in the coming days. The election day just around the corner. Going to be very interesting to see how things play out, not just on the presidential side, but also with the Senate map. And that's going to wrap this one up, guys. I appreciate you stopping by. Consider subscribing, and I'll catch you back here next time.